Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right. Welcome, everyone. John Corcoran here. I'm the host of the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where I get the privilege of talking with all kinds of interesting CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs of companies and organizations like YPO, EO, Activation Blizzard, LendingTree, OpenTable, Axe Software, and many more. I'm also the co-founder of Rise25, where we help connect B2B business owners with their ideal prospects and referral partners. And I'm really excited today. My guest is Pramod Raheja. He's the CEO and co-founder of AirDillat, which is a company based in the Washington, D.C. area, which is doing some really interesting stuff with drones in a commercial application, all kinds of interesting applications, helping larger companies, including the U.S. Air Force and Department of Homeland Security, entities like that. So we're going to talk about that. He's also a longtime EO member since 2011 and been an entrepreneur for many, many years, founded a number of different companies, in spite of the fact, and this is really interesting, is that he's a full-time pilot. So he flies for United Airlines, been a pilot for a long time, self-funded that, bootstrapped his way into it, not going through the military or anything like that, and manages to balance all these things and founding a EO qualified business, which is no easy thing to do. So we're going to get into all of that in a second. But first, before we get into this interview, this episode is brought to you by my company, Rise25 Media. And Rise25 helps B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And if you're listening to this and you like podcasts and you've thought, hey, should I do a podcast? Well, I say, yes, sir, you should. We specialize in B2B businesses with a high client lifetime value, helping you to build high caliber relationships with the people who matter. So to learn more and get more inspiration and ideas about how you can do this, go to rise25media.com, or you can also email us at support@rise25media.com. All right, Pramod. So really interested, you and I connected through EO. We were at Startup Grind conference right before the whole coronavirus pandemic hit and everything got shut down. So I was really glad that we got to meet. We connected through EO, which, by the way, if you don't know about EO, go to eonetwork.com or check out some of my past interviews with Vern Harnish, Daniel Marcos, or Dave Will, host of the EO 360 podcast, if you want to learn more about it. It's an amazing organization, which I've been involved with. You've been involved with since 2011. So let's first start. We chatted before, and you self-funded becoming a pilot while you were in college, I believe it was, because you were just passionate about it. And that's no small thing to do. It's not cheap, and it's also very time-consuming to do that. How did you go about that?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, John. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. And yeah, I think the passion for aviation and aerospace and just anything that flew was something that was ingrained in me. I don't know if ingrained is the right word, but just something I think I was born with. It was just a strong interest. So growing up, I had tons of pictures, not videos because we don't have videos back then, but pictures and posters of essentially flying machines on my walls. And my heroes were like the astronauts, the Apollo program. And so the desire to fly was kind of inherent in there. And it wasn't until college that I really had the wherewithal and the financial ability in terms of, like you said, bootstrapping, where I was working, had a job, and I was pouring all that money into taking flying lessons, and the ability to do that. And so when I did it, I like to say that when people go for their first flight where they're actually piloting the airplane, they either have a bug or they don't. They have we call it the flying bug, right? Where they're just like, oh gosh, I love this, right? And so then you either do what I did, was pursue it professionally, or you pursue it as a hobby and you enjoy it, and do it on the side of whatever you do. And of course, I kind of just immediately identified with this, the sort of being a pilot, we'll say. And I could see myself in those shoes. I could see myself doing it, and just followed that at that point from college, past and beyond college.
Yeah, and you were not in a small program or an easy program either. You were studying aerospace engineering at University of Maryland College Park, which is one of the most respected programs out there for that topic. So that must have been really time consuming doing both those things. I'm also fascinated with, the personal qualities that go into becoming a pilot and also go into becoming an entrepreneur, because some people would say that entrepreneurship is inherently risky and it requires a lot of courage. Same thing with piloting an airplane. There's a lot of risk involved, requires a lot of courage, requires a lot of preparation. What are your thoughts on the kind of the personal characteristics that go into both of those two types of vocations?
Yeah, well, I'll even take that a step further from what you just said about the characteristics that sort of align with each other. I like to say, so when I was in college, we talked about me being a pilot. What I really wanted to be was a test pilot. Test pilot, if you go
Even
back
more
to,
risky.
yeah, and if you go back to, if you Google Chuck Yeager
The
and
right stuff.
the right,
Mhm.
yeah, and there's a test pilot named Scotty Crossfield who was the first one to go Mach 2.0. Chuck Yeager was the first one to go, Mach 1.0, which is the speed of sound, and then 2.0, of course, being twice the speed of sound. So these were heroes of mine, and I thought, hey, I want to do that because it combines sort of this technical engineering aspect of flying an airplane with the actual flying, and then actually having to evaluate characteristics of different types of airplanes and aircraft. So I thought that was pretty exciting. So now if we sort of, kind of wind that into entrepreneurship, I look at entrepreneurship as going out into the unknown. So when you start a venture, for example, and you're not exactly sure, I don't think anybody as an entrepreneur is really exactly sure what's going to happen and how they're going to do. And of course, they're going to do everything they can to make it work. But you go out into the unknown, you venture out of the unknown. And that's the way I looked at test flying back then. I said, hey, if you're actually flying an aircraft that needs to be test flown because nobody knows exactly what their characteristics are going to come out of it, that's the same thing as entrepreneurship. So I think that characteristic is very similar in entrepreneurs.
Right. I'm sure that we could create a real long list of the overlap between the two areas, but one of them is continually learning. You need to constantly be learning, educating yourself, constantly upping your game, remaining abreast of all the changes that are happening, whether it's in the market or whether it's changes that are happening with aviation or the weather or things like that. So how did you apply this when you decided to get into entrepreneurship? Did you take a pilot's precision kind of approach to starting your first company? In other words, did you have a checklist? Did you spend a lot of time beforehand preparing before you launched your first company? Was that kind of the way that you approached it?
Yeah, I love the question. So I think it started with a lot of market research, understanding the market that I wanted to be in, which initially at that time was a consulting company. And so that's a great question. And so I would say, yeah, that, the as far as when we talk about entrepreneurship at a more advanced scale and, within EO and YPO and things like that, it's all about having process. If you want to have an entity that you've created be valuable to somebody else down the road, or even to somebody in your family, if that's something you're going to do, you're going to pass it on. You want it to have the right process. So the process and the checklist and those sort of things that you're, referring to are super important, and yes, are very much in alignment with, sort of what pilots do. The other thing I'll add to that, however, is that even though you do all those things, you certainly, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, have to, just like a pilot, consistently course correct. So when we fly from point A to point B, there are, even though you think you might it's a very simple, straightforward way to do that, there are things that happen along the way. Weather pops up. Air traffic control needs you to go left, right, up, down because of other traffic in the area. And so there's a lot of course correcting going on. So the same thing with entrepreneurship. You can have all the process in the world, but if you can't sort of be where, you can't have the situational awareness that we call it in flying in your business, then you'll probably get left behind. And, COVID here, unfortunately, for most of the world has been that sort of wake up call for all of us to say, hey, what are we doing in our businesses and in our personal lives that we maybe need to course correct on so that we can be ready for the next thing that hits, or even just to navigate, using again pilot terms, is navigate the crisis now that's happening right now as we're speaking.
It sounds like that your background, your training in aviation maybe has made you a better entrepreneur. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree. Yeah, it's a sort of this approach of, if you're a entrepreneurial CEO, as an example, you are kind of maintaining the situational awareness of the big picture, what you're doing, but then also making sure that you or somebody in your crew are managing the little details. So
Yeah.
in the airlines, or in military aviation, it would be your crew, and in the entrepreneurial world, it might be your management team.
And so your first company was a consulting company. You did consulting in healthcare, but taking some of your training from the airlines and applying that in a healthcare context. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So just like, as an entrepreneur or a manager or a CEO, you are continuously learning, as you brought up earlier, and you were learning how to be a better leader. Pilots also have to do the same thing. So if just so we do a little history lesson, back in the 1960s was the dawn of the jet age, and 60s, 70s, that time frame. And what was happening was a lot of airplanes were crashing, and the sort of conventional thinking was that there was some sort of mechanical malfunction going on. In reality, these planes were crashing because of bad leadership, and bad leadership just meant also potentially poor teamwork. And part of that was the cultural hierarchy. Part of that was just not knowing how to work with each other in this sort of very high risk, high reliability environment where if you make a mistake, bad things can happen. And so that was in the late 70s and 80s that this sort of training came about that significantly improved airline and military aviation safety. And the number of accidents significantly went down to where it was minuscule. Fast forward to the late 90s, where now I'm an airline pilot. I'm actually working in the department that teaches this sort of training, and I'm actually an instructor at the airline, teaching leadership training and facilitating with other pilots, training them on these principles. Fast forward a couple of years after, into doing that, and now it's late 90s, early 2000s, and I'm seeing that healthcare has a very similar problem. So I start digging up research on how do you apply this aviation paradigm to healthcare, start seeing a body of work, start to survey the market to see what companies are out there doing what they're doing, decide to start a company. And, just like many entrepreneurs have stories, my story is that I was so engrossed in this idea that one night, I think I stayed up till 5 a.m, Googling, before Google was really a verb, Googling everything I could find to see if this was a worthwhile idea to pursue. Eventually determined it was, and that was sort of what I call my first real business. But the reality was like many entrepreneurs, I was probably selling and doing things on the side, years before that, starting in school and college.
Right. Now, you started this actually not long after 9/11. What was it like as a pilot for you? How did your life change after 9/11? And what was it like? I'm always fascinated by this. People who founded a company shortly after 9/11, of course, the economy went very downhill very rapidly after that. We also had the dot-com bust. So first part of the question was, how did your life change as a pilot after 9/11? And the second part is, what was it like founding a company after 9/11?
Yeah, so both good questions. And I'd say, to answer the first one, as a pilot, life changed quite a bit. Everybody, pretty much all the major airlines at the time went bankrupt, which meant a lot of things, lower pay and all these types of things that come with a bankruptcy, potential of not knowing whether you'll have a job, of course, or not, furloughs, all kinds of stuff. I was fortunate not to be furloughed. However, still it had a big effect on my life. And I had to tell my wife that, it might be a good idea for her to look for a job. Meanwhile, I was also always kind of, like I mentioned, sort of had this entrepreneurial mindset. And one of the things that I always wanted to do, which you kind of alluded to earlier, which is, continuous learning and education, is I had always wanted to go to like a good MBA school. I always wanted to go to business school. And I, like you said, had done engineering. So I was looking at that time as 9/11 had happened, I was kind of accelerating my thinking to say, hey, maybe it's a good time to go to business school. I have no idea what's going to happen with this pilot thing. It's just too risky. And there's a big question mark as to what the world's going to look like in a couple of years here. So, anyways, to make a long story short, I didn't go to business school. I ended up starting another business after the consulting one. And I think part of that is just, I can't sit still. I'm a typical entrepreneur that says, hey, I'm just going to learn by doing. And then the learning is continuously happening. My whole nother conversation, maybe another podcast would be around my sort of thinking, and probably many other people's thinking around how higher education has changed and is no longer just go to school, get your piece of paper and go work. It's actually always learning, always listening to lectures, always taking courses that are relevant to you at that given point in time. So that was something that was ingrained in me from my dad a long time ago.
And to that point, you actually relatively recently completed the MIT Entrepreneurial Master's Program, which Entrepreneurs Organization EO is involved in. We can touch on that in a second. I thought it was interesting that you did that recently, in spite of all the different balls that you have in the air. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, as an entrepreneur, one of the challenges is when people doubt you, when friends or family question why you're doing it, or they doubt that you can succeed, something that every entrepreneur has to deal with. Was it harder for you in particular, given that you had this successful career? I mean, you're flying big planes for United. You're flying the A320, the 777, 727. Did anyone at any point say, hey, what are you doing, man? Why are you starting this side company? You should be focused on this.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think two things. One, that definitely came up. And I remember a good friend of mine who I taught him how to fly as an instructor way back in the day. And he was a successful real estate entrepreneur in terms of his family business in the Washington, D.C. area. And he said exactly what you just said to me. He said, hey, Pramod, you taught me how to fly. You're a great pilot. And, I respect you with your ability, and I would fly with you any day of the week. However, why are you starting a business? And, oh, by the way, I know that business really well. You're going to get crushed. There's no need for you to do that. And he's talking about a franchise, which I subsequently started. And, and it did scare me, honestly. I was had to think twice about it. I went for it anyways, because I felt like we could differentiate enough. We had enough value drivers. To make a long story short, we actually became the most profitable at that time. We were the most profitable unit in their franchise at that given time.
Let's talk about that. So Intelligent Office is the name of it. Did you found the concept, or was it you started a franchise within a larger organization?
Yeah, the second. I bought a franchise location within the concept, right?
Okay.
And geographically, and then expanded that over the next few years.
From 1 to 4 eventually.
1 to 4, yeah.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Why did you decide to buy into a franchise instead of starting your own company?
Well, it goes back to your question before about, hey, being a pilot, did you find it hard, or did people kind of say, hey, stick to the flying, or what have you, whatever the sentiment was. Well, the reality was, even though I had a strong interest in entrepreneurship and probably had some inherent, whatever things in my head that I had with me that are very entrepreneurial in terms of character traits, I also didn't know a lot. And I wasn't really interested in franchising, to answer your question. Like, I used to look at back when we used to read newspapers, there was this big franchising section in the USA Today and the Wall Street Journal. And it was every Thursday, I remember. And I would pop that open and look at all the franchises, and I would see all this food and all this retail. And I would say, that doesn't seem interesting to me. Margins are low, all these kind of reasons why you might not want to do a business like that. And then one day I saw the Intelligent Office, and it was a B2B business. And I immediately understand the business. I just understood the business model. And then eventually, after digging in a little bit and learning about it, I loved the margins, and I loved, how you potentially could have really large margins. And so I had enough business knowledge to know that and to figure that out. And then, fast forward, after doing a little bit of that research, I sort of dropped the idea. And then by maybe 5-6 months later, this is now in 2004, early 2004, I get serious about it again. And, decide to go. And then in the franchising world, they call it a discovery day, go to a discovery day and learn about the franchise, meet the management, they tell you all the great things that are happening, and so I did that, and I was really interested. So shortly after that, we went and purchased our first franchise. Yeah.
Okay. And this is an idea. Was this an idea that was ahead of its time or not? Because it seems like now is definitely, we were talking beforehand and you said now, certainly given what's happening in the world as we record this in late May 2020, coronavirus pandemic still happening worldwide, did you feel like it was ahead of its time or no?
Yeah. So really good question. And I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. One, the whole concept was about working from anywhere. In fact, that was the motto at the time. It was intelligent office, work from anywhere. And it's interesting that, I'm going to go back and forth in time a little. If I go to now, 2020, it's interesting when I watch CNBC or, or something like that, and they talk about working from home and how there's these new trends from working from home. This was something that I embraced and saw happening in 2004. Not that I'm a visionary, nothing like that. Just the point being that there was this whole concept out there that, working from home was a thing. And to answer your question a bit further, yeah, when we would sell, we had to educate people on the concept. We had to really truly educate them. We had to say, hey, this is how this works. And they're like, huh? You mean you don't have to have a fixed office? I could get all these services and all these office things that I would normally get if I had a fixed office, but I can do it and I can still work from home or my boat or wherever I want to. Yeah, you can. Now, fast forward to 2020, where, I would say even before COVID, it was more commonplace to work remote, work from home. But now there's a whole new population of people that have never worked from home that are finding it, a challenge. They're finding new obstacles they have to overcome, and eventually that'll all, of course, they'll do that. But so I would say yes, that business now is probably more valuable than ever in terms of the services it provides to the clients that it has.
Yeah. Now, as you moved on from that to something else, did you tire of it? What was why the decision to switch into a completely new industry, by the way?
Yeah. So I had brought in some partners as we were, growing the locations and growing the revenue base and all that sort of thing that happens when you obviously want to grow and scale a business. And eventually, after about 6 years, almost 7 of doing it, full time, being the managing partner, being the CEO, I decided to, hand over the reins to one of my partners and just kind of decide what's next for me. So interestingly enough, I took a little time off, like probably many people would do, and kind of did a 6-month, I'll call sabbatical. But also being an entrepreneur, I really couldn't sit still. So some of my clients kept hiring me for different types of consulting work. And so I did that. And a friend of mine said, hey, Pramod, you know what? You've never had a real job before. You've always been a pilot entrepreneur, but you've never worked in corporate America. And oh, by the way, I'm going to go be VP of sales at this little internet company in Virginia. You want to come work for me? And I said, sure. And so I went into the interview, and in the interview, I had an interview with 6 people at the company, VP of sales, VP of marketing, a whole bunch of the executives. And they said, hey, the CEO's here today. He'd like to interview. I said, great. Sit down with him. He looks at my resume and he goes, wow, you flew Boeing 777s? I said, yeah. Haven't done it in a while, but I was doing that. And he said, well, that's great. I'm really impressed and I like you a lot, but you're never going to make it here because, you don't have what we're looking for. We're looking for somebody with 10 years of software sales experience, doing sort of SaaS sales type thing. And I said, well, I disagree. I think I have the right characteristics to work, with you, work with your sales team and be effective. And anyways, make a long story short, he didn't want to hire me, but it wasn't really up to him. It was up to the guy who was bringing me in, the VP of sales and account management. He brings me in and 6 months later, I was their number 1 sales account manager. And so
now, do you think what the CEO was saying, was that a tactic, or is he being genuine? He just didn't think you.
No, I think he was being genuine in his sentiment of, hey, look, you don't even meet the minimum qualifications. I don't know why we're even looking at you. Kind of, it was kind of the sentiment,
Right.
And
that's an interesting culture that the CEO felt that way, and yet you were hired anyways.
Well, I was hired anyways because when I kind of skipped a step there. As we were walking out of the interview, he walked me to the last interview of the day, which was with my boss, who was the guy who was actually bringing me into the company and who recruited me. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be there. And he looked at him and he said, hey, I like Pramod a lot, but I don't think he's going to make it here. And my friend who was bringing me in said, you know what? I wouldn't waste your time. I think, I wouldn't waste your time. I do think he's a good hire. And then the CEO said, well, it's your number. You got to make it work in the world of sales, right?
You're right. Sure. It's on you.
Yeah. So then about a year into that, I got bored. I was number one sales guy. I was, really enjoying it, by the way, but I was an entrepreneur at heart.
Yeah.
So I went off and started another company that had been sitting in my, in my wheelhouse for a long time. And that was kind of that I'd say came out of Intelligent Office in terms of ideas, in terms of the ability to hire remote virtual talent. So it was a company I started called mystaffnow.com. And the idea was that you could have sort of vetted, and nowadays that's very ubiquitous. You can go to lots of websites like
there's
Upwork,
lots.
There's lots of those.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of niche. There's marketing, there's engineering, there's TopTal, there's all kinds of things.
So this is the beginning of 2012.
Yeah, this was the beginning of 2012. And I did that for a few years and sort of melded that into another company eventually. But bottom line is my heart was with aerospace, my aviation, aerospace. And so,
but ironically, of all your different entrepreneurial ventures, it took a while to get around to something even related to aerospace. But let me challenge you on that. Aerospace, I mean, drones, I got 4 young kids. Drones are child's toys, right? I mean, like, how are you taking drones or let me put it another way. What made you think this child's toy would have commercial applications?
Sure. And if you really look at the history of it, they didn't start out as child toys, right? If they started out in military aviation, right? As sort of these things that could go up in the air without a pilot and do things, whether it's surveillance is a big one, right? And that's how it started out with these big, what we call unmanned piloted vehicles. Yeah. And then form factor shrank to where now you have small drones or small unmanned aerial systems, as they call them.
Yeah. Also with batteries becoming lighter and lighter and more efficient.
Absolutely. Yeah. So all of different elements of technology that you would imagine that would cause you to be able to do something in a smaller factor. So batteries, components, all of that, computer boards, just thinking back to the days of the early super cray computers, and now the size of that computing power is in our phone. Similar thing with drones, right? If we use the same analogy, that everything shrank to where you could do it almost miniature, and they do have miniature drones. But to your point about being a toy, they didn't actually start out that way, and then eventually, there was a strong interest there's always been a strong interest in model aviation. People have been flying little remote control RC airplanes and for a long time, and so this just kind of became a natural bridge to drones as well.
Right. And so even though it started out of military application, you went and you sold to the military. So you sold it back to Homeland Security and Air Force. Some of those are some of your clients now. So talk a little bit about what you do, what AirDillat does.
Yeah, so we build essentially unmanned aerial systems, or drones, as we're talking about them, to use that terminology. And we focus on the artificial intelligence and autonomy that accompanies this actual hardware or drone. So in other words, how does the drone fly around on its own, think on its own, make decisions, and then accomplish a mission? And an example of a mission might be something that we're working on. You mentioned Department of Homeland Security. We've been working with them for the last couple of years, early on in the life of the company, where they engaged us through their Science and Technology Directorate, which is really their innovation arm of the government, of the DHS specifically, to develop more robust technology to go into confined spaces indoors where you don't have GPS signal, you don't have the satellite signal, and to do important missions around public safety. So those missions include search and rescue, as an example, disaster recovery, or if it's just general security of hey, we need to keep a place secure. We need to protect infrastructure. How do we do that? And how do we go in and out of buildings? Because most drones need a GPS signal. They need to use GPS to fly. So solving the problem of how do you navigate and see without GPS is a challenging problem. So that's the one we set out to solve and have solved, and are now launching product around as well.
Right. Now, what has been like selling this concept, which is evolving? It's a new bleeding edge type of product, and also selling it to the government, which tends to be more stodgy, longer sales cycles, stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's definitely something, a myth I'd like to dispel. So, but that was my thinking going into the government was, wow, I don't know if I ever want to work with the government. I see my friends who run government contracting companies, and you mentioned I'm a member of EO. We have a lot of government contracting members in EO, and I wasn't something that looked attractive to me. But that my thinking has changed around that, and here's why. Because what I've seen in the last 2 years, and it has been rapid in just in the last 18 months to 24 months, the government, especially the DoD, have really increased their sort of desire for innovation. And when I say that, what they're really trying to do is they're trying to meet young, innovative companies. And so by doing that, they're providing funding, right? Basically non-dilutive funding to companies like mine, to say, hey, we will give you money if we like one of your ideas to develop something. And then the goal being to actually put it to use in the DoD, but also in the commercial world. Many inventions have come about because of military trying to do something. GPS is one of those. So now they actually take a different approach. They actually say, hey, we only want to really talk to you if you're also trying to do something commercially. Otherwise, we don't know if we're really interested, unless you have something really super, super, super secret and special that nobody else has. Then maybe, we'll talk to you. So that being said, a company like mine wouldn't even probably be able to exist or even form if it wasn't for some of these innovation mechanisms that now exist within the government to go out, find early stage companies like Agility, meet them, get to know them, understand what their technology is, give them an opportunity to put in proposals for funding, and then if they win, give them that funding, and then give them even further ability to get more funding, continue and keep going. The traditional model always for a company like ours was, hey, go get some angel funding, then go to the VCs, and if you're early on in a product like ours, which is complex hardware and software combination, early stage money is hard to come by because they don't see it. They can't see the vision because you don't have something tangible to show them early on, right? Not until something becomes tangible and usable. But you need some money to get to that point even, because it does take a lot of effort to get there.
What is the potential for you? What do you see in the future for AirDillat? And I know one of the things we talked about when you and I chatted last was interesting applications for even cleaning inside spaces, like inside of stadiums, not using chemicals as you might think, but using like UV lights. That was one of the areas they said you were looking into.
Yeah, great point. So we are just in the last month and a half or so have partnered up, since this COVID crisis, have partnered up with a company that specializes with UV light technology for cleaning specifically. And they are subject matter experts, and they have a little sensor that's about the size, smaller than the size of your thumb. If you put it on you can put it on your thumb, but it's very, very, very powerful. And to use this on our drone. So our drones are probably the most maneuverable, agile on the whole market, and the ability to go into confined spaces or indoor spaces and be that maneuverable and agile gives it a very competitive advantage as a vehicle to do something, right? And in this case, as you're saying, the do something is actually using this UV light to actually clean without chemicals. And so, yeah, we are in what I call the integration stage right now of doing that, meaning that we have hardware that we've fused together using the UV technology and our drone, and we'll, over the early part of the summer here, go into testing, making sure that it works, that it's safe. That being said, UV cleaning technology, usually you don't want humans in the space that you're cleaning because it's very powerful light and can burn you. So typically we'd be going in after hours or an empty stadium, as you pointed out, or wherever the space is. It would be where nobody is at that moment in time.
Interesting. Really interesting application there. I wanted to circle back to what we mentioned earlier. You completed the EMP, Entrepreneurial Master's Program at MIT recently, in spite of all your education over the years. And you said, you were mentioning how you need to constantly be learning, and that's one of the reasons that you did it. So talk a little bit about what you learned from that program, what it is for those who don't know.
Yeah, sure. So the Entrepreneurial Master's Program is not your traditional master's program. You're not going to walk away with a piece of paper that says you have a master's degree. It is more a certificate, executive education, just like many schools have, executive programs, Stanford, Harvard, everybody has their own executive programs. There's a specific program at MIT called the Entrepreneurial Master's Program. It was formed many years ago with Vern Harnish and a few others, and it formed an alliance with Entrepreneurs Organization, or EO, early on. And so anybody can apply for it and get and go there if they get in. However, get accepted. However, EO has a very strong partnership. So it's marketed heavily within the EO circles. And it's probably the best thing I've ever done within EO. And there's many things I've done that are really been great in EO. And the reason I say that is because it is a graduate level program designed specifically for entrepreneurial CEOs. So everybody knows about the great business schools at Harvard or University of Chicago or UPenn or what have you. But those are designed, more for the purposes of, hey, let me get an MBA and go do something in business with that. Not necessarily be an entrepreneur. Sure, there's lots of entrepreneurs that have come out of those programs. This is designed specifically for entrepreneurial CEOs that are already established and want to up their game, and they want to do business globally, perhaps as well, is a big one. And so it's a 3-year program. You go there for 5 solid days each year for 3 years, 14-hour days, very intense, many speakers. So you kind of show up like you're about to go play a big game. You show up in the zone, ready to learn, ready to pay attention, ready to drink caffeine if you need to. So
it's a long day.
Absolutely long days, but really super worthwhile. The network that comes out of it is incredible. Each year they have a new class of approximately 60 CEOs from all over the world. In my class, we had about 24 countries represented.
Wow. And aside from that, talk a little bit about what role being part of EO has played for you, specifically being in, the format is you're in these small forums, which are comprised of other peers, basically other CEOs. What role has that played for you over the years in helping you starting different companies, selling different companies, navigating different challenges? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you described is really like a CEO peer group that becomes your private board of board that you can count on to be there for you and you for them as well, on a regular basis. So you get to know each other. You meet at consistent intervals. Typically once a month is the average, and you get together and you have essentially like a board meeting where you spend about 3 or 4 hours and then have a meal together. It's a typical format. Everybody's got different formats, but that's probably a very good average one. And in that 3 or 4 hours when you meet, anybody in the group, and usually this is planned ahead of time and scheduled and prepped for, and people are coached so that you get the most effectiveness out of this. But really what happens in those groups is people present issues that they may be facing in their personal lives and their business lives, and bring them to the table so that the CEO group, their peers, can weigh in and share experiences. Really is the big takeaway from that, and those experiences and what it might. And so in my case, to answer your question about how it's helped me and how it's played a role, absolutely. There are many times where if I was facing an issue, that I brought it to my peer group, where people sharing their experiences in that private setting, being vulnerable, what's said in the room stays in the room type of environment, played a significant role in the decision that was made subsequently, usually for the better, because you're learning that in those group meetings that, hey, you're not alone. And probably somebody experienced something that was similar to what you're experiencing, and they were able to share that with you, which now gives you insight that you didn't have before in order to make a good decision. So more data points, empathy, vulnerability, that all kind of plays into helping you navigate those difficult times in business and in your personal lives.
That's great. Well, I want to wrap things up. This has been great, Pramod. And I want to wrap things up with the question that I always ask, which is, let's pretend we're at an awards banquet, much like the Oscars or the Emmys or whatever award they give out for drone or aerial surveillance or whatever. And you're receiving an award for lifetime achievement for everything you've done up until this point. What I want to know is, who do you thank? In addition to family and friends, who are the peers, who are the forum members, who are the business partners, who are the people you acknowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would start in my case, and I would start with my parents. They were immigrants, came to this country. I'm first generation Indian American. They instilled in me super work ethic, constant drive for education and knowledge. My dad, I don't think I ever saw him go anywhere without a book And no matter where we went, if we were waiting at the doctor's office or whatever, he would be reading, and I'd be like, Dad, what are you doing? And he'd say, well, you know what, we're just sitting here. There's no point not learning, right? So that stuck with me, and I act the same way now. And then absolutely my spouse, who this year will be 25 years together, that I think that if you don't have that partner with you, it just doesn't make it as worthwhile. And they're there to support you and help you in good times and hard times. Then, you know, if you go to the larger community, I'd say EO definitely changed my life in 2011. Makes you, you know, I became a better CEO, better entrepreneur, better dad, better husband, all of that. And so there's many people in EO, too many to name here, that I would thank. My forum mates. I am a past president of the DC chapter, so even the presidents that I've worked with before and after, you know, we share a common bond of having the role of president. So we, you know, it's easy to pick up the phone and talk to one of them and be able to talk confidentially, because that's sort of, as president, you sort of had to do that sometimes, and that's always nice. And there's a lot of mentors along the way in terms of just, you know, people that actively mentored me or people that I watched. You know, I'd say there's a lot of EO speakers that I've seen. Warren Rustan comes to mind, that, you know, never actively mentored me, but I've seen enough of his talks that I consider him a mentor, right? And then finally, I'll thank my kids who, you know, in spite of the fact that they're the next generation and younger, still teach me on a daily basis a lot of things, and I consistently learn from them as well.
Yeah, that's great. I didn't want to break up your flow in the middle of that, but Warren Rustan is someone who is like the impossible person to get in touch with. Doesn't have a website, as far as I can tell. Speaks heavily in EO, but I've tried to reach out to him doesn't have a LinkedIn presence or anything like that. So anyone listening to this, if you have a connection to Warren, please introduce me, because I'd love to I'd love to interview him on the podcast. This has been great. AirDillat, AirGility.co is the website. Where else can people learn more about you and connect with you?
Awesome. Thank you so much, John, for having me. I've enjoyed this.
Anywhere else? LinkedIn, anywhere else that they should connect with you?
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that. Yeah, absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there, Pramod Raheja. I'm also on Twitter, same handle, Pramod Raheja. You know, and as well as Facebook and AirDillat. We have a presence on all of those as well.
Great. All right. Thanks so much, Pramod.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution.
Revolution.
And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.